There's a chair on that porch I want you to see before we go any further, because the whole of this story sits in it, or rather in the long years it sat empty. It's a ladderback chair, the kind a man builds himself out of necessity rather than vanity, the rungs hand-shaped with a draw knife on a winter evening when there was nothing else to do but make something that would last. And it has lasted. The low amber sun comes slanting across the plains at the end of the day, and it catches that chair, just so, throwing its long shadow back against the cabin wall, and you can see the dust drifting through the light like flecks of gold that don't belong to anyone. Look close at the seat. It's worn smooth, polished by years of a single body easing down into it after supper, by the slow rocking of a person who had earned the right to rest. One presence, and one alone, wore that wood down to a shine. There were two chairs once, set side by side the way married folks set them, but the other got broken in a hard winter and never replaced. And this one became something more than furniture. It became a kind of marker, a headstone that nobody had to carve words into, because the man who lived there knew exactly whose absence it measured. His wife had sat there. Her name was Clara, and she'd been gone 3 winters now, taken by the fever that swept through the low country one spring, and didn't ask permission of anybody. After she passed, Ezra Walker kept the chair right where it had always been, and he never sat in it himself, not once. He'd sit on the step, or lean against the post, or take the floor with his back to the wall. But that chair he left alone, the way you leave a grave alone, out of a respect that has no good name. They thought a great many things about Ezra Walker, and most of them were said quiet, behind hands, the way small towns do their talking. But the chair didn't care what they said. It just sat there in the amber light, catching dust, waiting on a thing it could not name. You've seen chairs like it, I expect, on porches across this whole wide country, and you've maybe wondered who sat there and who doesn't anymore. That's the question that hangs over every empty seat in every house where somebody used to be. The wood remembers what the heart can't quite let go of. And so for 3 long years, that chair held nothing but memory and morning light and the occasional dry leaf. The wind blew up against its leg. Nobody sat in it. Nobody was meant to. It was, in the truest sense, an empty chair, and an empty chair on a frontier porch is one of the loneliest sights God ever allowed to exist. Because out here a man builds a chair for company, for the long evenings when the dark comes down hard, and the coyotes start their crying, and you want another soul near enough to touch. To have a chair, and no one to fill it, is to live with a wound that won't close. Ezra knew that. He'd known it every single day for 3 years. But on the evening this story truly begins, the light was doing its golden work on that worn seat, the same as always. The dust motes drifting slow and patient, and a thing was coming up the road toward that empty chair that neither the chair nor the man who guarded it could have rightly foreseen. Keep that picture in your mind. The empty chair, the amber light, the smooth, worn wood that knew one body and grieved it. Hold it there, because everything that follows. Now turn your eyes to the road, the long rutted dirt track that ran from the edge of that nothing little town out toward the homesteads, scattered like seed across the open ground. There was a woman walking it. You'd have seen her from a long way off, the way you see anything moving against a plains sky, that big, just a small, dark figure pressed up against an enormity of pale blue and dust-colored distance that swallowed the world whole. She walked alone. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed, because women didn't walk those roads alone. Not out there. Not in those years. They came by wagon or buggy, or on the arm of a husband, or in the company of family, but they did not come walking by themselves down a road that led from town to nowhere in particular, carrying everything they owned in one carpetbag that swung against their leg. Her name was Nora Finch, though the name hardly mattered to the country she was crossing, which cared nothing for names and less for the troubles that went with them. She'd come west on a promise the way so many did, a promise made by a man who'd sent for her with sweet words and a little money for the fare, and a description of a life that sounded in the reading of it like something worth crossing half a continent for. She'd believed him. A woman, alone in the world, believes what she has to believe to keep moving forward. And Nora had been alone a long time before she ever stepped off that train. But the man who met her at the depot was not the man of the letters. He'd looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of returning, and within a handful of days after some words she would not repeat to anyone, he had put her off, abandoned her, left her standing in a strange town with a carpetbag and the clothes on her back and not enough money for a ticket anywhere. The way a man discards a thing he has decided he no longer wants and feels no shame in the discarding. The town had watched it happen. Towns always do. And the town had drawn its conclusions, because a woman left by a man must have done something to deserve the leaving, mustn't she? That was the arithmetic of the place, cruel and simple. So, Nora Finch walked. She didn't know where she was walking to, only that staying meant living under the weight of 100 judging stares, and walking at least meant motion, meant the small dignity of putting one foot down and then the other and going somewhere, anywhere, away from the eyes. The carpetbag pulled at her arm. The sun pressed down on the crown of her head through her bonnet. Her feet had begun to blister inside boots that had walked too many miles already. But she kept on, because there is a kind of woman who will walk straight into the empty heart of a continent rather than turn back and ask mercy of people who have already decided she doesn't deserve any. The dust rose around her hem in little clouds. The plains stretched out to every horizon, flat and pitiless and beautiful, in the way only enormous, lonely places are beautiful. Somewhere far ahead, a thin column of smoke rose from a chimney, and a cabin sat low against the land, with a porch facing the road. She could not have known what waited there. She only knew it was a place, and a place had a roof, and a roof was more than she had at that moment. So she fixed her eyes on it and she walked, small and alone and abandoned, into the long amber evening, with nothing left to lose, and a stubborn flame of something in her chest that would not let her lie down in the dirt and quit. That flame is the truest thing in this whole story. Remember it. Ezra Walker saw her coming before she saw him, for he had the high ground of the porch and the long habit of watching the road, a habit a man develops when he lives alone and the road is the only thing that ever brings news, good or ill. He was leaning against the porch post, the way he always leaned when the day's work was done and there was nothing left to do but watch the light go and wait for the dark, and his arms were crossed loose over his chest, not in the manner of a man bracing for trouble. Beside him sat the empty chair, and he stood beside it the way he always did, near but apart, guarding it without quite knowing he was doing so. He was not a young man. The years and the weather had worked on him the way they work on everything out there, drying him out and burning him brown and carving lines into his face that told the truth about a hard life lived honest. His hat was an old battered felt thing, sweat-stained and shapeless, pulled low so the brim threw a shadow across his eyes, and those eyes were a curious hazel, gold in some lights and gray in others, and right now they were fixed on the small figure, laboring up his road and trying to make sense of what they saw. A woman, walking, alone, with a bag. He turned that over slow in his mind, the way he turned everything over, because Ezra Walker was not a man given to quick conclusions. The town would have had her judged and sentenced before she'd walked another 100 yards. But Ezra had long ago lost his taste for the town's way of reckoning people. He'd been on the wrong end of it himself after Clara died, when the talk had it that he'd let her get sick, that he should have sent for the doctor sooner, that a man who lived as far out as he did had no business taking a wife at all. He'd heard the whispers, and he'd swallowed them, and he'd gone on living, because what else is there to do? So when he saw a soul in obvious trouble coming up his road, the first thing in his heart was not suspicion. It was something closer to recognition. He knew what it looked like to be cast out. He knew the particular slump of shoulders that comes from carrying a thing too heavy for too long, with no one to help you carry it. His expression, if you'd been near enough to read it, was neither guarded nor eager. He didn't reach for the rifle that hung just inside the door, the way a careful man might. But neither did he straighten up and wave and call out a welcome, the way an eager one would. He just watched, steady, the way the land itself watched, patient and unhurried, and taking the full measure of a thing before it decided anything about it. The amber light lay across the porch boards, and across his weathered hands, and across the smooth-worn seat of the chair beside him, and for a long moment the whole scene held perfectly still. The man on his porch, the woman on his road, the empty chair between them, and the great wheel of the sun rolling down toward the rim of the world. He wondered who she was. He wondered what had put her on foot and alone. He wondered in the quiet way a lonesome man wonders whether she might be in need of the very thing he had too much of, which was solitude broken open, an evening shared, a roof against the coming dark. But mostly he just watched her come, and he did not move, and he let her close the distance at her own slow pace, because he understood, without being told, that a woman walking a road like that did not need to be rushed. She'd get there when she got there. And he would be standing right where he was, beside the empty chair when she did. But Nora was not yet free of the town, not entirely, for a town like that does not let go of a person all at once. It keeps a hand on them long after they've turned their back on it, in the shape of eyes that follow and tongues that wag, and the long, cold reach of its judgment across open ground. She'd gotten perhaps halfway out the road when something made her glance back over her shoulder, the way you do when you feel a stare on the nape of your neck, and there they were, set against the distant cluster of false-fronted buildings and the dull gray boardwalk, two figures standing stock-still and looking after her. She couldn't make out their faces at that distance. They were just silhouettes, dark cutouts pasted against the pale wall of the mercantile, but she didn't need to see their faces to know what was written on them. She'd seen it written there, for 3 days running. The pursed mouths, the narrowed eyes, the slight lean of one head toward the other as words passed between them, words she could not hear, but could feel just the same, the way you feel weather coming before the clouds show. There goes the woman that was put off. There goes the one no decent man would keep. Look at her now walking out toward the Walker place, and him a widower, living alone. And what kind of arrangement do you suppose that's like to be? She knew the shape of their thinking, because she had lived her whole life inside the shape of it. A woman's reputation in that country was a fragile, precious thing, held in trust by everyone but herself, and the moment a man chose to throw her away, That trust shattered, and the pieces became the property of every gossip on every boardwalk, from there to the territorial line. It did not matter that she had done nothing wrong. It did not matter that the fault was entirely his. The man who'd sent the lying letters and then looked at her like spoiled goods. The arithmetic of the town did not run that way. In the town's ledger, a discarded woman was a guilty woman, and that was the end of the figuring. Nora felt her shoulders go tight, the muscles drawing up across her back, the way they did when the shame came on her, a hot, prickling shame that had nothing to do with anything she'd done. For one terrible moment, she nearly stopped. She nearly turned. Some weak and beaten part of her wanted to walk back into that town and let it have its way with her, because at least the town was a known cruelty, and the empty road ahead was a country of unknown ones. But she did not turn. I want you to understand the size of that. The way a small thing can be the largest thing a person ever does. She did not turn back. She stood for one breath, with the dry prairie wind catching the fringe of the sage-green shawl she'd crocheted herself in better days, the wind lifting it and worrying it the way the town wanted to lift and worry her, and then she set her jaw, and she faced forward again toward the low cabin and the thread of smoke. Let them stare. Let them lean their heads together and pour their poison. She had decided, somewhere in the long miles of that road, that she would rather be a stranger walking toward an unknown roof than a known woman crawling back toward a known scorn. The wind pulled at her shawl. The dust stung her eyes. Behind her, the two silhouettes watched until she'd shrunk to nothing in the distance, and then they turned and went back inside to tell the others what they'd seen. And the story of Nora Finch began its slow poison spread through the town. But she didn't know that, and it wouldn't have changed her step if she had. She kept walking. The cabin grew larger, and there, when she finally raised her tired eyes to it, was a man standing on the porch beside an empty chair, watching her come. She came up to within a few feet of the porch and stopped, because she didn't rightly know how to do anything else. There's no proper way to introduce yourself when you've walked out of a town that's cast you off and you're standing in the dirt before a stranger's home with your whole life swinging in a bag from your fist. Nora opened her mouth to say something, some explanation, some plea, some account of how she'd come to be there, but the words wouldn't form. Her throat was dry from the dust, and the walking and the long held-down fear, and what came out was nothing at all. She just stood there, gripping the carpetbag handle so hard her knuckles had gone white, looking up at the weathered man on the porch and waiting for the judgment she had learned to expect from every face she'd met for 3 days. But the judgment didn't come. Ezra Walker pushed himself off the post slow and easy, and he didn't say a hard word, and he didn't ask her business in the cold way she'd braced for. He looked at her with those gold-gray eyes for a long moment, taking the full measure of her, the way he took the measure of everything, and then he did a thing that she would remember to the last day of her life. He turned his head, and he looked at the empty chair beside him, and then he turned back to her, and he raised one hand, palm open, and gestured toward the chair. It was a simple thing, just a hand, lifted, offered. But the gesture carried everything, and then he spoke, his voice low and rough, from disuse, and roughened further by some emotion he didn't show on his face, and he said the words that gave this whole story its shape. He said, "I've got an empty chair." He let that hang a moment in the still amber air, the dust drifting between them, and then he said the rest of it, plain and unhurried and without any flourish, like a man stating a fact he'd already made peace with. "And I don't care what they say." That was all. He didn't explain who they were. He didn't have to. She just walked past them on that road, felt their eyes on her back, and he'd watched her glance over her shoulder at the distant figures, and they both knew exactly who they were. The town, the talkers, the keepers of the ledger that had her down as guilty. Ezra had lived long enough under that same scrutiny to know precisely what she was carrying, and in 3 words, he had set it down for her, picked up the whole crushing weight of the town's opinion and tossed it aside like a man tossing a stone. "I don't care what they say." Nora stood there with her bag still gripped, and the words went into her the way water goes into ground that's been dry too long, slow at first, because the dryness resists it, and then, all at once, soaking deep. No one had said a kind thing to her in longer than she could rightly recall. No one had offered her anything but a sideways look and a closing door since she'd stepped off that train. And now this stranger, this rough-weathered man, on his lonesome porch, was holding out a chair to her. A chair she could see, even from where she stood, was worn smooth with use and treasured, and he was telling her that the opinion of the whole world could go hang. His lips were still parted, the last of the words just spoken, and the offer hung there in the dust between them like a thing she could almost reach out and touch. She did not know yet that the chair had belonged to his dead wife. She did not know what it cost him to offer it. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, a door was opening instead of closing, and on the other side of it was something that might just be kindness, and she had forgotten what kindness felt like, and it nearly buckled her knees right there in the dirt. What happened next happened all in her face, and if you'd been there to see it, you would have understood why the old folks say the eyes are the one true window in the whole of the human house. The amber light was full on her now, slanting in low and gold from the western rim, and it caught every line and shadow of her, the fatigue that had set into the corners of her mouth, the dust gone to mud in the tracks her tears had cut earlier on the road and dried again, the hollow places under her cheekbones where the last 3 days of poor eating and poorer sleeping had carved themselves. She was not an old woman, but she wore the look of one in that moment, the look of a person who has carried too much too far. And then, slow as the sun going down, something began to change in her face. It started in the eyes, those brown eyes that had been guarded and braced and ready for the next blow, and the bracing went out of them by degrees like a fist unclenching finger by finger. The fatigue would not leave for a good while yet. But under it, around it, something softer began to rise, a kind of trembling hope that she clearly did not trust, that she was afraid to feel, because hope had been the very thing that put her on this road in the first place. She had hoped before. She had believed sweet words before, and the believing had nearly destroyed her. So, even as the softening came into her eyes, you could see her fighting it, holding it back, asking herself whether this was real or whether it was just another pretty lie dressed up in a stranger's kindness, the kind of thing that would turn cruel the moment she let her guard down. Her mind ran the figures fast. A man alone. A woman alone. The town would say one thing about that, and the town would be wrong, but its being wrong had never once stopped it. And what did she know of this man, save that he had a gentle voice and an empty chair and a face that looked like it had done its own share of grieving? But there was something in that face she could not argue away. She had spent her whole hard life learning to read men, because a woman alone has to read men the way a sailor reads weather, her safety depending on it. And everything, in her experience, told her that this man was not lying. There was no greed in his eyes, no hunger, no calculation. There was only a steadiness, a plainness, a kind of tired, honest decency that she had nearly stopped believing existed in the world. Her fingers, which had been white-knuckled around the carpetbag handle for so long they'd half forgotten how to do anything else, began to loosen. Just a little, just enough that you could see the blood come back into them. She was not deciding yet. The decision was forming in her the way a thing forms in deep water, rising slow toward the surface, but not yet broken through. She thought of the road behind her, of the town and its eyes, of the man who'd put her off, and the long miles she'd walked away from him. She thought of the night that was coming, the dark and the cold and the coyotes, and the simple animal truth that a body needs a roof. And she thought most of all of those three words. I don't care what they say. No promises in them. No sweet talk. No lies a clever man might tell to get what he wanted. Just a flat, plain statement that whatever the world thought of her, it did not change what he was offering. And it was the very plainness of it, the lack of any flourish that made her believe it. A liar dresses his words up fine. An honest man lets them stand naked. She drew a breath, the first deep breath she'd taken in what felt like days, and the air smelled of dust and wood smoke and the dry, sweet grass of the plains, and somewhere in the drawing of that breath, the decision finished forming, though she had not yet let her body act on it. She knew what she was going to do. She just had not done it yet, and then she did it. There was no grand announcement, no speech, no thanks even, because some things are too large for words and too fragile. And Nora had learned that words could be the most treacherous things in the world. Instead, she simply bent at the waist, slow and deliberate, and she set the carpetbag down on the porch planks beside the leg of the empty chair. That was all. She set the bag down. But I want you to understand what was in that small motion, because the whole turning of her life was folded up inside it, the way a whole oak is folded up inside one acorn. For 3 days, she had carried that bag. It had been her constant companion, her single possession, the sum total of everything she owned in the world. And more than that, it had been the symbol of her condition. A person carrying a bag is a person in motion, a person between places, a person with no place. The bag in her fist had said, plain as anything, I do not belong here, I am only passing through, I am a traveler with nowhere to land. As long as she held it, she was still a woman being put off, still in the act of being discarded, still moving away from one rejection toward the next. But when she set it down beside that chair leg, on those weathered porch planks, in the long amber light of the dying day, she said something different, something she could not have brought herself to say out loud. She said, this porch is a place, and I will let it be a place for me. She said, I am setting down the thing I have been carrying, and I am setting down with it the road and the running and the long, cold expectation. The bag came to rest against the chair leg with a small, soft thump. The only sound in all that stillness save the wind and the grass, and her dusty boot heels, which had been planted in the traveler's stance, ready to turn and walk on. You'd have seen it if you'd been watching her feet. The heels came down flat and grounded, the toes turned in toward the porch instead of out toward the road, and her whole body, which had been leaning ever so slightly away, the way a body leans when it's poised to flee, eased and settled, and gave its weight to the ground beneath it. It was a small, irreversible act, the kind that changes everything without anyone raising their voice. She had not spoken a word. He had not touched her. There was no contract, no understanding spelled out, nothing the town's ledger keepers could have pointed to and named. There was only a bag set down on porch planks and a woman's weight shifting from flight to rest. But Ezra saw it, and he understood it, and something moved across his weathered face that he could not have hidden if he'd tried. Something between relief and wonder, and a grief that was finally after 3 long years. The chair beside her, the empty chair that had held nothing but memory and morning light for 3 winters, was no longer being walked past. A woman had set her bag down beside it and put her weight upon her own 2 feet and chosen, of her own free will and against all the screaming counsel of caution and shame, to stay. The dust motes drifted in the gold light. The shadows stretched long across the boards. And Nora Finch, who had been cast off and judged and made to walk a lonesome road with everything she owned in one hand, stood quiet on a stranger's porch with her hand finally empty, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply be still. He did not make a fuss of it, and that was the mercy of him. A lesser man, or a more anxious one, might have rushed about, might have made speeches, might have tried to fill up the strange new silence with talk and reassurance until the very effort of it made the thing feel false. But Ezra Walker had buried a wife and lived 3 years alone, and he knew that the deepest kindnesses are the quietest ones, the ones that ask nothing in return and make no show of themselves. So he simply turned and went inside, and after a moment she followed him through the low doorway into the cabin, leaving the bag where it sat by the chair. The inside of that cabin was a single room, plain and clean and ordered the way a careful man keeps a place when he's the only one to keep it. There was a hearth with the coals banked low, a narrow bed in the corner with a quilt that a woman's hands had clearly made long ago, a few shelves of stores, and in the center of it all a table, hand-carved, the legs and edges shaped with the same patient care he'd given the chair. He pulled a chair out from that table, a different chair, an ordinary one, and he motioned for her to sit, and she sat. And then he took up the battered tin coffee pot from the edge of the hearth, where it had been keeping warm, and he reached to the shelf and took down a mug. It was a cracked ceramic mug, white once, gone the color of old ivory now, with a faded blue ring painted round the rim that had nearly worn away with washing. He poured the coffee into it slow and steady, the dark steam rising up between them in the lamplight, and he set the mug down on the carved table in front of her, easy, without ceremony, the way you'd set a cup before any soul who'd come a long way and needed warming. Nora looked at that cup, and then she looked at him, and she did not know that the mug, too, had been Clara's, the one his wife had favored, kept on the shelf untouched, the same way the chair had stood untouched on the porch. He gave it to her plain, with no explanation, because to explain would have been to make a weight of it, and he did not want her to feel a weight. He wanted her to feel welcome. His scarred jaw, which had been set hard for 3 years the way a man sets his jaw against grief, was relaxed now, gone soft in the lamplight, and there was an ease in his movements that hadn't been in them in a long while. He poured a second cup for himself, the ordinary tin one, and he sat down across the table from her, and for a while neither of them said much of anything. The coffee was hot and strong and a little burnt, the way a bachelor's coffee always is, and Nora wrapped both her hands around that cracked mug and felt the heat of it go up her cold arms and into her chest. And she had to bite down hard against the tears that wanted to come. Because there is nothing in this world quite so undoing as plain kindness offered to a person who has gone too long without it. She had braced herself against cruelty for so long that she had built up a great wall of hardness to meet it, and kindness came at that wall sideways and found it had no defense at all. She drank the coffee. He watched her drink it, not in any improper way, just the way you watch over a thing you've decided to care for, making sure it's all right. The lamplight pooled gold on the carved table between them. Outside, the dark was coming down over the plains, and the coyotes had started their distant crying, but in here there was warmth and light, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and two lonesome people sitting across a table from each other for the first time, and the quiet between them was not an empty quiet at all. It was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. There came a moment later that evening when Ezra stepped back out onto the porch alone, and what he did there is the very heart of this story. So listen close. The lamp was lit inside now, and through the window its warm glow spilled out onto the boards, golden and steady, and you could see Nora's shape moving small and easy in that light, finding her way around the place, making it a little more lived in with each thing she touched. But Ezra stood at the porch rail with his back to all that warmth, and his face turned out toward the dark, and far off, across the black plains, you could just make out the scattered lights of the town, little pinpricks of lamplight where the talkers lived and the ledger keepers slept. He stood there, with his hands loose at his sides, not clenched into fists the way an angry man stands, not braced the way a fearful one does. Just loose and open and easy, his shoulders down. He was thinking about them, those lights. He was thinking about what they'd be saying come morning when word got round, and word always got round. He knew exactly how it would go. He'd heard it all before, after Clara died. The whispers and the looks and the way folks would go quiet when he walked into the mercantile and then start up again the moment the door swung shut behind him. He knew the town would say he'd taken in a fallen woman. He knew they'd say worse than that. He knew the preacher might come out to talk to him, gentle and grave, about the appearance of things, about what was proper, about the souls of men, and the temptations of the flesh, and the importance of a community's good opinion. And Ezra Walker, standing there, at his rail in the dark, with the lamplight of his own home warm at his back, found that he did not care, not one whit. He had said it to her on the porch, and now he proved it to himself, in the silence of his own heart. I don't care what they say. He had spent too many years living for that town's good opinion, and getting nothing back from it but cold looks and colder shoulders. He had watched his Clara die and heard the town blame him for it, and he had learned a hard truth that some men go their whole lives without learning, which is that the opinion of people who do not love you is worth precisely nothing, and the comfort you can give to one suffering soul is worth more than all the good standing in the world. There was a woman inside his cabin who had been thrown away by everyone, and he had picked her up, and the town could think of that, whatever it pleased. Let them talk. Let their lamps burn, and their tongues wag, and their ledgers fill up with his sins. He stood at the rail and looked at those distant cold lights, and then he turned his head and looked back through the window at the one warm light that was his own. The light with a woman moving easy inside it, and the choosing was the simplest thing he had ever done. He breathed in the cool night air. He heard her humming, soft, some old tune from wherever she'd come from, and the sound of it went into him like the first rain after a drought. 3 years that cabin had been silent. 3 years he'd come out to this rail, and stood alone and looked at the dark, and felt the great hollow ache of it. Now there was humming behind him, and coffee on the stove, and a bag set down by a chair, and a future that had been blank as the night plains suddenly had a shape to it. He let out a long, slow breath, and with it he let out, finally, the last of the grief he'd been carrying. Not because he'd stopped loving Clara. A man like that never stops, but because he understood at last that honoring the dead does not mean refusing the living. The empty chair had taught him that. Or maybe she had. He didn't rightly know. He only knew the night was no longer lonesome, and the town could go hang, and that was the end of his caring what they said. And so we come back to the porch, where this whole story began with an empty chair, and where it ends, though endings on the plains are never truly endings, just the place where the teller stops. It was golden hour again, the way it had been when Nora first came up the road, the sun gone low and warm and turning the whole world to honey. But everything was changed now, and you'd have seen the change at once if you'd come up that rutted road and found the homestead at the close of the day. There were two of them on the porch now. Ezra sat on the step where he'd always sat, his old hat pushed back, his weathered face easy in the light. And in the chair, the ladder-back chair, the worn, smooth chair that had stood empty for 3 long winters, holding nothing but memory and morning light, sat Nora Finch. She had the cracked ceramic mug, with the faded blue ring, cupped in both her hands, and she was leaning back into that chair like she belonged in it, like the wood had been waiting all those years for exactly the shape of her, and maybe in some way it had. The long prairie shadows stretched out before them across the dirt, the shadow of the cabin and the shadow of the porch rail, and the 2 shadows of the 2 people, and where once there had been only one figure's shadow falling across that ground at evening, now there were 2, side by side, reaching out together toward the east where the night would come. They weren't talking much. They never did need to talk much, those 2. Some days she'd tell him a little of where she'd come from, and some evenings he'd tell her a little of Clara. Because he found in time that he could speak the name without it cutting him, and Nora would listen, and there was no jealousy in her. Only a kind of gratitude toward the woman whose chair she'd been given and whose absence had made room for her arrival. The town did talk, of course. The town talked for a good long while, and some of the talk was ugly, and the preacher did come out, just as Ezra had figured, and Ezra heard him out polite and then sent him on his way unmoved. In time, a circuit judge passed through, and Ezra and Nora stood up before him and were married plain and quiet, and that took some of the wind out of the talkers, though not all of it, for a certain kind of person will always find something to whisper about. But it didn't reach them out there, didn't carry across all those miles of grass to the porch where they sat in the golden evenings with the shadows stretching long. They were past the reach of it. They had built, out of 2 broken and discarded lives, one whole thing the way you build a chair, out of plain wood and patient work, and it was sturdier than anything the town could throw against it. So there they sit. In the last picture I'll leave you, with the man on the step and the woman in the chair, the cracked mug warm in her hands, the prairie wide and golden all around them. The chair is not empty anymore. It will not be empty again for a long, long while. And if you ever find yourself out on those old roads, and you come across a worn, smooth chair on a lonesome porch, I hope you'll remember that somewhere a man once looked at such a chair and looked at a soul the whole world had thrown away. That's the thing about an empty chair, friends. It isn't waiting to be guarded. It's waiting to be filled. And the bravest, kindest thing a body can do in this hard and lonesome world is to look at someone with nowhere left to go and say the simplest words there are. I've got an empty chair, and I don't care what they say.